El señor Afif Safieh es uno de los diplomáticos palestinos con mayor trayectoria. Ha servido en las tres capitales de mayor importancia política, en Londres, en tres capitales de mayor importancia política, Londres, Washington y Moscú. Tiene formación académica en Ciencias Políticas y Relaciones Internacionales por la Universidad Católica de Lovaina y el Instituto de Estudios Políticos de París. Además de las embajadas mencionadas, ha sido director adjunto de la misión de observadores de la OLP ante la Oficina de las Naciones Unidas en Ginebra. Fue miembro de la oficina de Yasser Arafat en Beirut, encargado de los asuntos europeos y las instituciones de la ONU, representante de la OLP en los Países Bajos y delegado general de Palestina ante la Santa Sede. Su cargo más reciente ha sido el de embajador palestino en la Federación de Rusia y desde 2008 es embajador itinerante para misiones especiales con sede en Londres.
Thank you, sir. In the play by Bertolt Brecht on Galileo, there is a beautiful scene where Galileo, under the pressure of the Inquisition, retracts his scientific discoveries. And a disciple of his looks with great anger and says, "Unhappy are the people who have no heroes." To which Galileo answers, "No, my friend, unhappy are the people who still have a need for heroes." As you all know, we the Palestinians, we still have a need for heroes. And here I would like to bow in respect to the collective hero, the Palestinian people themselves. But let me tell you that I believe that we are all deeply moved by the tribute paid to Ambassador Issam Salim, because he was one of the Palestinian heroes. He was the veteran, a founding father of Palestinian diplomacy. I was proud to have been his friend in yonder years. I knew the father, today I met the son. I always knew the Holy Spirit of the Trinity of the family. And Renda, we were always proud of you in Palestinian diplomacy because your partnership made you a couple which was bipolar, where both components were extremely important and efficient to our cause. Ladies and gentlemen, we are meeting here today within the framework of the week around the International Day of Solidarity for the Palestinian people. And since we are speaking of memories and recollections, I remember in 1992, Ambassador, in London, in the House of Commons, in the Parliament, on the day like today, I started my speech then by saying, what can we wish the Palestinian people on the International Day of Solidarity? And I said, the best wish we can make to the Palestinian people is that they no more need an International Day of Solidarity, because as long as they need an International Day of Solidarity, it means that their problem, their tragedy, is totally unresolved. Yet, let me tell you, this lecture was not given a title. If I were to give it a title, I would say Israel-Palestine, History Undecided. I believe that the political challenge, the moral dilemma in the Middle East is the following. We either have, Mr. Ambassador, today, either have one people too many in the Middle East, we the Palestinians, or we have a state which is missing and needs to be created. I believe the verdict of the international community, as has been pronounced in the United Nations Forum, is that there is a state missing and needs to be created. But unfortunately, history is still undecided. And let me tell you, as a political activist, I never belonged to the optimistic school of politics that believes in predetermination, that the oppressed people will inevitably be victorious one day. I don't believe in historical inevitability. I believe, Mr. Ambassador, unfortunately, history is a cemetery of oppressed people who remained oppressed until they vanished into historical oblivion. Hence the need for the collective hero, the Palestinian people, and individual heroes like Dr. Issam Kamil. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe we have been maltreated by history, we the Palestinians, yet we did not receive our legitimate share of understanding, of sympathy and solidarity. And I believe the explanation is that we were the victims of European history. we became the Jews of the Israelis. And because we were the victims of European history, we were denied and deprived of the legitimate solidarity and sympathy we might have aspired for. What can we say today, 2013? I believe we can very easily say that, alas, unfortunately, the Nakba is not a frozen moment that has happened sometime in history in 1948. Unfortunately, the Nakba is an ongoing process. The catastrophe is an ongoing process until today. I believe that the constant Israeli policy, left, right, or center, is how to acquire as much of Palestinian geography as possible with as little of Palestinian demography as possible. And I believe that today, 20 years after the Madrid process, or even more, we are 22 years now after the Madrid process, one can say that the years of theoretical peacemaking were not years of Israeli withdrawals, but were years of Israeli expansion, because we have witnessed the elastic growth of those illegal settlements. These are the harsh realities. And let me tell you, as diplomats, today the diplomatic impasse is not due to an Arab rejection of Israeli existence. The diplomatic impasse today is due to an Israeli rejection of Arab acceptance, because they are not ready to comply with the territorial prerequisite. Since we are speaking of memories, I remember in October 91, when the Madrid conference was taking place, I was invited by Sky TV to be in their studio to comment live on the event. And I remember how Shamir, the then prime minister, in his own particular way, said, "We want you to believe of Israel's hunger for peace." And I, on TV, on Sky Studio, said, "We can satisfy Israel's hunger for peace if they abandon their appetite for territory." And I believe that if we look at things with hindsight in 2013, we should admit that the territorial appetite has been the major factor to ridicule and disrupt and torpedo the peace process the way it was engineered and structured at the beginning. I remember, sir, telling Norwegian friends, because after the Madrid process got stagnating in Washington, there was the back channel in Oslo. I remember joking years later with our Norwegian friends, telling them if the Oslo back channel has not yet put Palestine fully on the map, it has put Norway on the map. And you remember probably how the world was intrigued, how teeny-meeny small Norway was playing a diplomatic role beyond its geographic size and its demographic weight. And usually, Kifah, I offer this idea to the European Union, because I personally believe that Europe is still an actor in search of a role, and we in the Middle East, we have a role in search of an actor. If we could merge the two, we will all live less unhappily ever after. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we have a process that was re-triggered. And I, for one, believe that we didn't need one more process. What we needed was pressure. Because in the international community, the professionals of diplomacy around the world know what is desirable, what is possible, and what is acceptable. And I believe, Ambassador, that we, the Palestinians, we, the victims of history, we have been much wiser than those who chose to be our enemies. And one of the paradoxes of the Middle East conflict is that the oppressor hates the victim much more than the victim hates the oppressor. And I personally believe that we, the victims, we moved beyond double negation in favor of mutual recognition faster than our oppressor that is still undecided on this issue. And we have stopped asking for absolute justice. We are only asking for possible justice. And I believe we all were tormented when we reduced our level of political expectations and became what I call, we became unreasonably reasonable by asking only for possible justice. And I believe, sir, that what has happened in the last 40 years of international diplomacy was not the world aligning itself on our preference. It was we and the Arab world aligning ourselves on the international community's consensus, which was the two-state solution. And today, ladies and gentlemen, since we are committed to respect all our commitments taken to the international community, the challenge today is whether the international community will respect its commitments towards our people. And I always used to say, Palestine is a test in politics between courage and cowardice, political courage and moral cowardice. And let's hope that our rendezvous with history, with moral courage, is not in the too distant future. Now we have a process re-triggered. And I will not conceal from you, I'm always glasnostically transparent, that we don't have great expectations. And I believe in 2013, one can study that process and the flaws and the mistakes of the process. I believe there are two major flaws why we needed 22 years not to achieve peace. What has become durable is the process instead of peace becoming permanent. It's the process that became durable. And I believe there are two flaws. The first flaw is that the peace process was left to the local belligerent parties to sort it out. That was the scenario that the Israelis preferred, because there is such an imbalance, an asymmetry of forces. Israel preferred that approach of direct negotiations between the local belligerent parties. And the Israelis thought, Mr. Ambassador, that in that framework, they can dictate and decide the ceiling of the possible and the permissible, and the pace, if any, of progress. And the process was kept hostage to the Israeli domestic arena. How often during those 22 years haven't we heard, oh, the Prime Minister of Israel cannot afford to accept this idea because it will damage and ruin the coalition, the ruling coalition in Israel. And for the Israelis, it suited them because it was gaining them time that the process remained hostage of the Israeli domestic arena. And I always used to say to Israelis that we don't have problems with part of your political establishment. We have problems with the entirety of your political establishment. I don't believe that the Israeli Labor Party are angelic. I believe that it was labor that waged the ethnic cleansing process in 1948. It was labor that waged the war of 56 against Egypt for the Suez Canal. It was labor that started with the settlement building, the labor that started with the idea of the wall. And I used to tell them it's labor, the doves theoretically, that made Palestine unlivable to us Palestinians. What Likud is doing is making Israel unlivable to many Jews. But yet we want to make peace. But peace is too important to be left to the Israeli side to decide upon how much percentage they are ready to withdraw from. You remember the case of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Nobody said, let's make a referendum in Iraq to see what percentage of Kuwaiti territory they will withdraw from, etc. The international community was firm and said, you should withdraw or else. The answer then was to say that they were interested because Kuwait had oil. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I have news for you. We too happen to have oil, olive oil, meaning we too happen to have rights. And I believe the international community today is expected in the most unequivocal manner to tell the Israeli political establishment, but Israeli public opinion, that this is what the world expects from you. So please elect your future leaders and your political parties in function of their political program, their charisma or the absence of charisma, but not on the basis of what percentage of territory they are ready to withdraw from. That decision is not an Israeli domestic decision. There are rules and codes of conduct in the international community. We are not like in the 18th, 19th century with European settlers arriving in the North American continent against the Native American Red Indians. Today we have a united nation, we have a corpus of international law and legislation on the basis of an itinerary and an experience of mankind that goes through centuries. So we cannot accept what was permissible or happened in the 15th, 16th, 17th century in the two Americas and allow it to happen today in Palestine. So ladies and gentlemen, I believe today we are at a very important moment in regional history and in world history. And let me tell you that I, for one, believe that today we don't need a process, we need pressure. And I believe the European Union, who up to now was limited, restricted, tolerated as a payer, should demand to be a geostrategic player taking part in the shaping of the desired future Middle East. America remains decisive. And I believe America today should deserve an analysis about the intriguing, fascinating Israeli-American relationship, because I believe this is decisive for peace or its absence in the Middle East. Sir, there are two schools of thought in the study of American-Israeli relations. There are those who believe there is an Israeli America and those who believe there is an American Israel. There are those who believe that the superpower dictates on its regional protégé what should be its regional policy, and there are those who believe that Israel enjoys the support of an extremely powerful lobby in Washington, which dictates on the American administration what should be its regional policy. I, for one, believe about the strength of the pro-Israeli lobby, and I believe the weeks that we have just witnessed have just proven how Netanyahu has tried to disrupt the beginning of diplomatic engagement between the six powers and Iran to solve the issue of nuclear proliferation. On that issue, by the way, we, the Palestinians, believe that it's a good thing to stop nuclear proliferation in the Middle East, but the better policy would be is to work for a nuclear-free Middle East, meaning that we should convince and pressure the Israelis also to show a willingness to relinquish their detention of the monopoly of the nuclear weapon in the Middle East. And I believe it should be a consideration in the coming peace process that once peace is achieved, Israel should be available and ready to relinquish its monopoly of the nuclear weapon. Now, Obama. I remember, Randa, when I was for 3 years in Washington, on the lecturing circuit, I would constantly be asked, what do you think of Obama, who was then only a candidate with not much chances of success? And I would answer that as a diplomat, I'm supposed to exercise self-restraint. But my wife, who usually was with me, my wife believes that Obama is reawakening American idealism, which was true during the first campaign, and that Obama was the ideal candidate to reconcile America with itself and America with the world. And I will not conceal from you that Obama came with the best of intentions. We all remember the speeches he made in Istanbul and in Cairo, speaking of a new chapter between Western, Occidental, and Eastern Oriental relations, between the Christian world and the Islamic world, and we were very hopeful and had great expectations. But let me tell you, I, for one, believe that Obama, during his first mandate, unfortunately, was defeated 4 or 5 times by Netanyahu in Washington itself. And by the way, if you read Haaretz the way I do twice a day, you would know that Netanyahu, landing in Washington during the period of his first confrontation, was telling his entourage, I am stronger than this man in Washington, and went out to prove it. And we all remember that when he spoke to the joint combined Congress on Capitol Hill, he had 29 standing ovations, totally undeserved. And Yuri Avneri, an Israeli decent politician, wrote by saying, it reminded me of the Stalin's parliament, except that those parliamentarians standing up and sitting down 29 undeserved times were not doing that in front of the local dictator and autocrat, but for a foreign dignitary that was just passing through town. You know, there is a joke, Randa, in Washington that says, do you know why Israel doesn't want to be the 51st state of the United States? And the answer is that if they were to become the 51st states in the United States, they will only have 2 senators then. Now they can, in a way, control 90 plus. It's a sad joke, by the way, but humor is supposed to reflect reality. And So the first problem and the first flaw with the peace process was that the peace process was left to the local belligerent parties to sort it out, and Israel thought that it could dictate the ceiling of the possible and the permissible. The second flaw, Mr. Ambassador, is the self-inflicted impotence of the international community. The Middle East is not any part of the world. It's a very indispensable and a very inflammable part of the world. Palestine happens to be at the cross-section of three major continents. It's at the cross-section of Asia, Africa, Europe, that were the center of gravity of international relations from the beginning of historical periods up to today. So the self-inflicted impotence of this international community is one difficult to understand, and we might all pay a heavy price for it. And I always used to remember de Gaulle. Few of us are sufficiently young or old to remember General de Gaulle, but he was a statesman like they make them no more. And de Gaulle, after the 67 war, had an idea of his own which he called la concertation à quatre, which was the coordination of the four major powers. Popular China was not yet into the Security Council. And his opinion was that the four major powers should meet, decides what should be the contours and the content of the desirable peace, and signal to the local parties what the world unequivocally expects from them. Unfortunately, this idea never really took off the ground. I think there were 4 meetings in New York of the permanent representatives of those 4 powers in New York, and then it disbanded. Why did it fail? The Americans in '67 were not unhappy with the Israeli military victory. It compensated the humiliations of Vietnam. The Soviet Union, short-sighted like they frequently could be, preferred the bipolar constellation where they and the Americans would discuss world issues and couldn't understand why they should give equal status to lesser countries like France and England. The English were unenthusiastic simply because the idea was French to begin with. And unfortunately, since then, we have a durable process instead of lasting peace. Mr. Ambassador, I think we would like to engage with your distinguished audience today. Let me just end by saying that I, for one, naively thought always that a territory that was occupied in 6 days, if there was a political willingness, could also be evacuated in 6 days so that the Israelis can rest on the 7th. And I, for one, because maybe of my Christian upbringing, have always believed, even in very dire moments, that Palestine will inevitably one day resurrect. And as you know, we have had some previous experience in resurrection. And the last point that I will make, sir, is that Hegel, when he was asked about his verdict on the itinerary of humankind or mankind, he said, from history we learn that we have not learned from history. I think Hegel wouldn't mind if we all were to combine forces to prove him wrong, at least on that one. Thank you, sir.